You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Archaeology Show. TAS goes behind the headlines to bring you the real stories about archaeology and the history around us. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeology Podcast, episode 50. I'm Chris Webster.
And I'm April Camp-Whitaker. In today's show, we are talking with Dr. David Kilby about the Solutrean question and early human migration here to North America.
Let's dig a little deeper. April, welcome to episode 50. How's it going?
It's going pretty well, although I'm kind of shocked we made it to episode 50.
I know. We've been mostly going for the past, every 2 weeks for the past, 2 years? 3 years? 2 years? I think 2 years.
I think 2 years, yeah.
Yeah. So that's pretty good. 50 episodes in 2 years. It's every other week. Then 50 episodes is about right. We've only missed a couple of them. But with two busy schedules, and you have babies, and, I have all the baby companies and projects and things that I'm doing, it's amazing we've been able to keep it going this long. So I just want to say thanks for keeping it going throughout your crazy schedule. And here's to 50 more, I guess.
Yeah, and thanks to any of our listeners who've managed to stick with us for all 50 episodes. And for those of you who haven't been with us for 50 episodes, I recommend you go back and listen to them and get to listen to right. Chris and I develop as podcast hosts. Well, me develop, since Chris has like 6 other podcasts. So,
hey, if I'm not always developing, then I'm going to get out of this. If I'm not always getting better, there you go. All right, so we have a great episode today. I'm a cultural resource management archaeologist, which means I have to, technically I have to focus on pretty much everything in all time periods. Anything over 50 years ago is what I'm quote unquote interested in, because when we go out and do stuff, we can't pick and choose our sites. We record what's there. That being said, I've always been incredibly interested in really the earliest questions. It's probably why I was interested in paleoanthropology in college. I was like, okay, well, where did they come from? Where did they come from? Where did they come from? And it just goes farther and farther back. And that's why I'm pretty excited about the discussion we're going to have today, because the question of how did people get to North America and when is a huge question in archaeology. And we're going to talk about some hypotheses today and what we know. And to do that, we're going to bring on a special guest. His name is Dr. David Kilby, and he's an associate professor at Texas State University. Dr. Kilby's research interests include North American Paleo-Indians, hunter-gatherer archaeology, Southwest prehistory, cultural resource management, and a variety of other topics. He's primarily interested in the archaeology of the earliest inhabitants of the Americas, however. Dr. Kilby has been an editor, co-author, and author on numerous papers related to these subjects. One recent publication is particularly relevant to this discussion and is linked in the show notes, along with a few other topics. So, Dr. Kilby, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and honored to be on your 50th podcast.
Outstanding. There you go. So I'm going to kick this right off. Since we're talking about the early inhabitants, first off, I'm interested in your story a little bit. How did you get interested in studying, the earliest North Americans?
Well, I guess I could offer you the long story or the short story, or maybe I'll go with the medium short.
That sounds good.
By the time I discovered archaeology and that one could do that for a living in college, and it turns out that you can, just barely, my initial interest was in the archaeology of the Southwest, the traditional Pueblo and farming version of Southwest prehistory. And that brought me out to New Mexico. And in pursuing my graduate degree at Eastern New Mexico University, I got to work at the Blackwater Draw site, which I think most archaeologists in North America are aware of as being the type site for Clovis, the Clovis site. And so while I was pursuing my interest in looking at the geoarchaeology of Four Corners Puebloan sites, I became more and more intrigued by Pleistocene archaeology. And one of the things that really drew me right in is you're really looking and thinking about a different world. And I think that's true of prehistory in general, regardless of whether the entire environment is different. But that's really taken to another level by Pleistocene archaeology, where you're having to work out different landscapes, even with regard to water availability and biomes and different animals on that landscape, and people that are adapted to that environment in ways that we're not even familiar with among current hunter-gatherers. So that sort of drew me right in.
All right. So before we go any farther with this, because we're going to throw these terms around quite a bit, let's talk about some date ranges here. You're talking about Pleistocene archaeology. You're talking about Clovis. What are some of the time frames that we're really discussing when we're using these terms?
Well, and when I'm referring to the Pleistocene, I'm referring to it, as an archaeologist might, as opposed to a geologist, which really emphasizes, at least in North America, the late Pleistocene. And Pleistocene is sort of synonymous with Ice Age. You can fairly say Ice Age archaeology and have that be equivalent to Pleistocene. However, technically, the Pleistocene consists of a series of Ice Ages. And from the perspective of North America and figuring out the origin of populations in North America, we're really most interested in that last glaciation during the late Pleistocene, which is it maxes out about 18,000 years ago. We call that the last glacial maximum.
So that's the point when you say last glacial maximum, that's the point at which the glaciers had advanced as far as they're going to advance. And then, we must have gone into some sort of warming period again, and the glaciers started to retreat at that point or shortly after that maximum, correct?
That's exactly right. And so after about 18,000 years ago, you see a gradual retreat of glacial masses globally. And, until, by about 8,000 years ago, depending on where you are on the landscape, you reach sort of the modern extent of glaciers.
Okay.
So you have, several thousand years there where glaciers are in retreat. The North American, the North American continent is gradually warming and drying. One of the things that's interesting is it's not a smooth and gradual process all around. There's this sort of whiplash about 13,000 years ago that we refer to as the Younger Dryas. So I haven't defined the age of Clovis yet, but among friends, we'll say it's between 12,900 and 13,400 years ago.
Okay.
So a good sort of, middle range for that is about 13,000 years ago. You have throughout most of North America a gradually drying and warming landscape. And then right about 13,000 years ago, there are some changes having to do with mostly oceanic circulation patterns that sort of reverse that pattern, and we go into a little mini ice age, if you will, for about another 1,000 years, between 13,000 and 12,000 years ago, that we refer to as the Younger Dryas. And it's right at that whiplash that you see the extinction of most of the large mammals that we associate with the last ice age. That's when we lose mammoth and mastodon and horse and camel and some of the other great beasts of the late Pleistocene.
So when you talk about Clovis, I know that, the Clovis are identifiable by these very distinct artifacts, specifically Clovis points.
Right.
Are there other aspects of kind of Clovis culture that differentiate and separate them from groups before and after? Can you just tell us a little bit about who are Clovis? What is Clovis? How is that definition being used? Well,
I might start with you pointing out that Clovis is recognizable based on fluted projectile points, and that's true. They're quite distinctive, and interestingly, they occur across North America, from Maine to Washington State to down into Mexico, possibly further into Central America. It's the only time that we know of in the prehistory of the Americas that a single technological tradition characterizes the whole continent. So that in and of itself is distinctive about Clovis. In addition to the points, there are some other sort of technological signatures. One of these is Upper Paleolithic style blades. And that's sort of a technical term, and due to the fact that we often use the word blade to refer to any sort of sharp edge. But technically, from the perspective of lithic technology, Upper Paleolithic style blades are these very specialized elongated flakes that are made from a specially maintained core that are a distinctive technology both geographically and temporally. And for example, in the Old World, the appearance of true blades is considered a signal of the transition from the Middle to the Upper Paleolithic, meaning in most cases the arrival of modern humans on the landscapes, for example, in Europe. They are blade makers, as opposed to using Mousterian technologies like you think of associated with Neanderthals. And so, interestingly, Clovis are also blade makers, which makes them pretty consistent with the Upper Paleolithic cultures worldwide here in North America. And that drops out at the end of Clovis. It comes back here and there. For example, and the Maya and the Aztec are proficient blade makers with obsidian in later prehistory. But that's sort of a revival of that older technology.
So I've got a quick follow up on the on Clovis real quick. I was going to save this for much later, but since you brought it up, I got to ask you again. As a CRM archaeologist, I feel like I'm kind of adjacent to a lot of fields, but you don't get to dive into a lot because
Right.
you got to be kind of next to it and understand a little bit of it. And the one thing that's always sort of irked me from a just a stylistic point of view and a date range point of view is that Clovis is a term that we apply to this, we call it morphology. So that, the shape of a certain technology, the technology style and the shape and all that stuff, we apply that term to the Clovis culture and the projectile points that they had. And that it, like you said, is across the continent, right? So it's across North America. It's across the continent. It's found all over the place.
Everywhere where there's not ice.
Everywhere where there's not ice. Exactly. So you find it all over there. Now, as a CRM archaeologist that's worked in 18 different states in this country, from the East Coast to the West Coast, from, Northeast, Southeast, Southwest, Northwest, I've worked all over the place except for Alaska and Hawaii. I see throughout time, these projectile points that also share very, very, very similar characteristics across the landscape, not only in time, and I think the time spans are much bigger for some of these, sometimes 2,000 or 3,000 years, but they're very similar, yet they have hundreds of different names regionally,
Right.
these. And so why has Clovis been able to hang on to that? And why have we assumed that it's the same, quote, culture that has transmitted that technology across the landscape, where we don't assume that for other projectile point typologies?
Right. It's a good question, and one without a very easy answer, I think. The problem that you describe is most acute probably in the East Coast, in the eastern woodlands, where we have a wide variety of different fluted point styles. And that's one of the key characteristics of these early Paleo-Indian projectile points. Redstone comes to mind, Gainey, a variety of other fluted points in the east. And the problem there is, or one of the problems, is we have so few opportunities to date sites with those projectile point styles on them. Most of what we know about the age of Clovis comes from Western Clovis sites. And so these are sites that have been well stratified and well buried, and we have opportunities to date charcoal or bone or other organic matter associated with them. They're these sort of big kill sites that most people associate with Clovis. So you have things that are datable, and that's less common in the East. And so many of our assumptions about what is Clovis and what isn't, and how old is Clovis in the East, are based, on comparison to these sites in the West. And it is a bit of an unanswered question, and it's not. I wouldn't say it's assumed that these other cultures are the same as or slightly younger than Clovis. It's based on, usually stratigraphic evidence or other sort of ways at getting at relative chronologies, but. With that said, we really don't know how old these are. And I think that's one of the things that leaves a lot of elbow room for having the East Coast be a little bit of a black box with regard to initial colonization. It's easy to say, for example, they might be there earlier because we don't have a lot of radiocarbon data to either refute that or support it.
Okay, so we are coming up to the end of this segment in a few minutes here. However, and I want to kick off the next segment because I intended to do it with this one, but we got sidetracked, which is good. I want to kick off the next one really talking about the Solutrean hypothesis and what that means,
Okay.
Especially in reference to the eastern United States there. But before we do that, and before we talk about the Solutrean, can you give us a brief overview of some of the other migration theories into North America? What are some of the other big predominant theories that archaeologists are considering that may not be the earliest? Solutrean may be the earliest. It may not be. I don't know. But what are some of the other routes that people could have taken to get here?
Well, maybe 20 years ago, we thought we had it figured out and it all fell into place. The idea was that during a period of lower sea levels due to maximum glaciation, the New World and the Old World were connected via the Bering Strait. What is now the Bering Sea would have been dry land. And so that gets people, literally modern humans who are already in Siberia, that gives them access to the New World via a land bridge. And we call it, we thought of it as a land bridge, but, also recognizing that this is a mass of land as wide as Alaska, twice as wide as Texas. And so you wouldn't necessarily be aware that you're crossing any sort of bridge between two continents. And we call that area Beringia. And so traditionally we get people here via Beringia, maybe around 13 or 14,000 years ago. And then as glaciers start to melt, you get this corridor between the two major glacial land masses in Canada, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran glaciers. As they part, you get an ice-free corridor between them. And that opens up right at the right time to get people down to Clovis, New Mexico on time, around 13,000 years ago. And as we started looking at that more closely and looking in more detail at some of the sites and some of the timing of environmental changes, that model sort of turns out maybe not to be as robust as we had hoped. For one thing, there aren't any sites of the right time period there in the ice-free corridor. There is no... Part of that model was that Clovis as a technology was invented somewhere in Beringia and brought down into North America. And it turns out that we don't see anything that looks like Clovis really up in Beringia. There are some fluted points in Alaska, but they look like they're later than Clovis. It looks like, on the other hand, Clovis is actually, sort of backwashed back to the north at some point after it's developed as a technology farther south. And so as these complicated realities are dawning on us, people start looking more closely at a coastal route. And the problem with the coastal route had always been, two problems. One is whatever the coast would have been would now be submerged. And so it's hard to make an argument based on negative evidence. All those potential sites would be underwater. The other problem is that that western ice mass in most places would have extended out into the sea. Those glaciers would have been calving off directly into the sea. And so getting around those would have been a huge obstacle, and it might require watercraft. And we don't have any evidence on either side of Beringia that early for the use of watercraft. Okay. So, and those are sort of the sort of contemporary competing models. The idea of a trans-Pacific crossing and island hopping across the South Pacific has been floated, but none of the island archaeology supports that. People just aren't there till thousands of years later. And of course, the big thing that has really allowed us to evaluate some of these models in the past 10 or 20 years is genetics, is modern genetic research.
Okay, well, we will leave it there for this segment then and come back and dive a little more into the Solutrean hypothesis on the other side of the break. Back in a second.
This network is listener supported. We're trying to move away from paid advertising while also creating new shows and supporting the ones we have. The APN has never and will never make a serious profit on our podcast. Every little dime we make goes back into the network and improving show quality. So become a member today at www.archpodnet.com/members to show your support, get some extras, and be a benefactor for archaeological education. Members get stickers, a coffee mug, a t-shirt, bonus content, early access to episodes, a private Slack team to talk to other members and the hosts, and full access to training on Team Black over at arccert.black. So check out our memberships at www.archpodnet.com/members today and support archaeological education. That's www.archpodnet.com/members.
Have you ever wanted your own podcast just like the one you're listening to? I'm Chris Webster, and I'm the producer, editor, and mixer on this show. I teach people how to create podcasts, interview guests, and edit and master audio. If you just want a show, I also do full production and editing so you can focus on the content. If you want to learn more, head over to propodcastnow.com. That's propodcastnow.com to get your idea out to the world today. One more time, propodcastnow.com. Now back to this very well-produced show. All right, welcome back to the second segment of the 50th episode of the Archaeology Show. And we are talking to David Kilby about Clovis culture and the earliest inhabitants into North America. So, David, we had alluded to the Solutrean hypothesis. I mentioned it in the last segment, but I really want to dive into that now. First off, where does the word Solutrean come from?
The ultimate origin of the word I'm not sure of, but archaeologically it refers to Upper Paleolithic cultures of specifically France and the Iberian Peninsula between about 22,000 and 18,000 years ago. Folks that are hunting caribou, and well, I guess they're not caribou; they're reindeer over there. Reindeer and horse and mammoth, in other words, the same sort of suite of, or a similar suite of late Pleistocene animals in Europe.
Okay. And my last recollection of how the Solutrean hypothesis came to be was a certain projectile point was found in Eastern North America, and really correct me if I'm wrong here, but a certain projectile point was found in Eastern North America, and the style of that point seemed similar to this Solutrean time frame in France, and people are like, what the heck is going on here? And it dated to something like 17,000 years ago stratigraphically, if I'm not mistaken, something around that time frame. Can you correct me on those details and fill in the blanks?
I think they're not incorrect, but I think there's more to it. So I think
I'm sure there's a lot more to it.
I think you may be referring to the Sinmar biface, which was actually dredged up by a trawler, a fishing boat off of southern Virginia, or basically the Virginia North Carolina border, and it was dredged up along with a mastodon bone, and is what we would call bipointed in shape. So it has this sort of laurel leaf shape, which is similar to what Solutrean points look like, and the finding of this is something that was seen as very supportive of this idea of a Solutrean connection, although it's not what led to it. And so, interestingly enough, the idea for a Solutrean connection goes way back to the 1960s, when Frank Hibben was excavating in Sandia Cave. And Sandia Cave is in northern New Mexico, just outside of Albuquerque. And in this cave, they had Folsom artifacts, which were well known to be Ice Age artifacts here in North America, well established because of the discovery of the Folsom site, and then again at Blackwater Draw. And so in Sandia Cave, you have this Folsom layer, and then you have a layer of travertine, and which is flowstone in a cave, and below that you had these sort of shouldered points that were taken to be very similar to Solutrean points. And Frank Hibben made this argument that these look very Solutrean, and argued that there may even be a possible connection between Europe and North America in the earliest Paleo-Indian period. And that idea never really caught on. And as a matter of fact, there's lots of problems with Sandia Cave as an archaeological site. It turns out that travertine had been breached and the strata were mixed. And now we see those points that he was calling Solutrean being actually archaic in age, actually being several thousand years younger than he thought. But he was the first one to sort of propose this idea, and then it went by the wayside. It didn't gain much traction, and these were seen to be more of sort of a technological parallels as opposed to having any sort of historical relationship. And it didn't really get revived until the 1990s, when Dennis Stanford at the Smithsonian Institution and Bruce Bradley, who's now at Exeter, began publicly promoting the idea that Ice Age Europeans may have reached the American continent as much as 20,000 years ago. And,
wow. And
they argue that this is, earlier than people of Asian origin. They're not arguing that it's necessarily instead of folks coming from Northeast Asia, but that it's earlier. It's an earlier wave of people, and that they are the direct ancestors of Clovis. And they make this argument largely on the basis of technological attributes that Solutrean and Clovis have in common, and one of them are these well-made bifaces that are common to both Solutrean and Clovis, and we see them both in caches. That's something that hopefully will come around in the conversation as well. So they argue, Bruce Bradley and Dennis Stanford argue that there are some technological aspects of tool making that are so similar between Clovis and Solutrean and so different than other people that it must mean that there is a historical connection. And by that, I mean, it must mean that Clovis is descended from Solutrean people who somehow made their way across the North Atlantic during, 20,000 years ago, like I said, is roughly the last glacial maximum. That's right around the time of the last glacial maximum. And so they argue that that Solutrean people, who we know as terrestrial hunters, as land-based big game hunters, actually had a marine adaptation that we don't see because it's underwater with rises in sea level. So they argue that Solutrean people gradually adapted to a maritime adaptation, which would include sea mammal hunting and probably deep sea fishing for cod and so on, as much as 22,000 years ago. And then as they followed abundant fauna farther out onto the ice sheets and farther into northern Europe, they began trekking farther and farther westward, following sea mammals, following fish and birds and other resources, until they eventually made landfall in what is now the New World, or what is now North America, somewhere around the mid-Atlantic. And so their sort of ground zero for landfall for Solutrean folks would be the coast of Maryland, Virginia, that area. And so that's why to them it was so significant to find this particular point associated with a mastodon right off of the Virginia coast.
Mm-hmm.
To come back around to that Sinmar biface, it turns out that, when you look closely, these dredgers, these fishing boats, dredge for miles. And so whether that mastodon bone and that biface came from the same place is really unknown. And it's the mastodon bone that dates to, you said 17,000 years ago, and that's correct as far as I know. But that doesn't, the actual, we don't know the age of the biface or how well it's associated with that mastodon bone.
Right.
I'll throw that out there as a little bit of skepticism.
So this is really interesting. So part of what we're getting at then is this idea that with the Solutrean hypothesis, we might have not a single kind of wave of migration to to North America, as sort of the earlier hypotheses were proposing, but maybe potentially multiple waves of people coming from different parts of Europe and Asia, finding routes over to this continent.
Right. That's the implication. And I think no one would argue with that there are multiple waves of migration from Northeast Asia as well, and eventually along the Pacific coast and so on. What the Solutrean hypothesis adds to the mix is arguing that one of these waves comes from Northern Europe. Well, it goes against much of what we think we know about North American prehistory. Lawrence Strauss, who is at University of New Mexico and is himself specifically a Solutrean archaeologist, pointed out when this idea was sort of made public, that if you're going to entertain the idea of a Solutrean connection for Clovis, a Solutrean origin for Clovis, then first you have to account for 5,000 years and 5,000 kilometers. And so by that, he meant we have 5,000 kilometers of open ocean to get those populations across. And there's a 5,000 year difference in age between what we know the age of Clovis to be in North America and the age of Solutrean to be in France. And so that, I think that criticism actually spurred Stanford and Bradley to start, actively trying to fill in that gap with sites and with ways of getting them across the ocean.
Yeah, because the it doesn't matter what side you look at, whether it's from Europe to northeastern North America, or say Siberia over the land bridge or over that way. I mean, people are dealing with a almost year-round frigid cold environment that they had to live in, and what was the motivation, to even get across that, over the course of a couple thousand years.
Right. And what's the likelihood that you would get not only, a couple of people shipwrecked on the coast of North America, but what's the likelihood that you would get a viable biological population of people established there that then, flourish and spread westward?
I mean, an interesting argument to what you just said, too, is the Vikings, because we do have Viking settlements in northeastern North America, but we don't have their DNA and, Native American populations with Viking DNA, do we?
Not in any, well, not earlier than the historic period.
Right, for sure.
But I would counter that with saying that Vikings are using, technologies that developed, tens of thousands of years later. And
for sure,
archaeological evidence of this technology and of their seafaring. And as I mentioned, for Clovis, even along the west coast, and also for Solutrean, we have no evidence of boat use. I think we can assume that they're capable of making a raft or even a dugout canoe. But as far as the technology necessary for seafaring, there's not evidence for that on either continent at that time.
Right. This is it's such an interesting question for me. That's because I love these questions that are unanswered. People seem to think when we look at some of our technology, our modern technology, thinks that we've got it all figured out, right? But when you come down to these most basic questions, like how and when did people get here, like we really still don't have the complete picture. And I was reminded of an episode we did, and I looked it up here back on May 6th, 2017 with Dr. Stephen Holland. And he was talking about this supposed 130,000-year-old possible archaeology site. And by saying archaeology, you're implying human involvement in San Diego.
Right.
100,000. Now, they're not saying conclusively this is true, but all the evidence points towards this could be human related. Maybe it was a one-off, kind of thing, like the Viking sites, like they just happened here. Maybe they all died there. Maybe they left. Who knows? But I don't know how people would have gotten here. But like you said, seafaring technology wasn't really a thing. So if people were getting here 130,000 years ago, why aren't they still here? What happened? Is there multiple waves? We still don't have the answers to those questions. It's interesting.
I'm a big proponent of Occam's razor, which is the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions is the most likely to be true. And when looking at the potential for a 130,000-year-old site on the west coast, or a landfall of Europeans on the east coast, there are so many things, so many assumptions you have to make, and so many rules you have to break based on what we know what we know well about North American prehistory, that when you really start scrutinizing these ideas, they become less and less robust. They become less and less probable, and from my perspective. A corollary to that is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And sometimes people who promote sort of an outside the norm idea are frustrated by that they're being particularly singled out or being scrutinized more heavily than others. And I think in science, that's fair enough. If you're proposing something that is extraordinary, then you're going to have to shore that up with extraordinarily robust data, with extraordinarily robust evidence.
Yeah, the Topper site comes to mind in South Carolina.
Right. Well, so kind of feeding off of that, I mean, I know that when this idea of the Solutrean hypothesis was first being proposed, it was getting a lot of kickback from the academic community of people sort of saying, well, there isn't this evidence. How do you justify this? So is it becoming a much more widely accepted hypothesis? I mean, I know that you've been working, and one of the articles that we were reading is sort of filling in some of these gaps and trying to look at where are there possible connections. And you were saying that other researchers have been working on this. So is it becoming more and more accepted? Because, in science, you propose something and then 50 years later, people finally agree that it's true.
I would argue based on my exposure and my experience that it's the other way around. I think it has probably, it met with great popular excitement, the Solutrean hypothesis did. And it got great traction in the media and great traction among the interested public, sort of, non-professional archaeology. it never did take a very strong hold among professional archaeologists, and I think argue with some confidence that it's actually that it's waning in popularity from the little popularity it had among professional archaeologists. I think professional archaeologists have all along been very skeptical of it, and particularly those who specifically work in the Paleo-Indian period, those who know that record the best, see lots of problems with this hypothesis. And as a matter of fact, when I published my article, I had this sort of feeling like, well, this is already sort of a dead horse. This is a horse that's been beaten to death already. And surprisingly enough, as I worked on this, I find that there's, especially in the public, a lot of interest and a lot of questions still about the Solutrean hypothesis. But as you may have gathered from my article, as I specifically look at this one aspect of it, comparing Clovis caches to Solutrean caches, I find that there's not any ground to make a connection based on that data set.
Well, I think that's a great segue to our break, and we can come back and kind of talk about what caches are and your article and those connections.
The Archaeology Podcast Network has partnered with TeePublic to bring you some awesome gear that looks good, promotes archaeology, and puts a few pennies in our pockets so you can get free podcasts. Check out our designs at arcpodnet.com/shop. That's arcpodnet.com/shop.
Welcome back to the Archaeology Show, episode 50, and we are going to wrap up our discussion with Dr. David Kilby about the first peoples coming into this continent of North America. And one of the things that you had talked about, David, in I think the last segment or maybe the one before that, was the concept of Clovis caches and the way that we find these points. First, what's a cache? And then, maybe elaborate on why they're important.
A cache is sort of a general term that we use to any sort of collection of materials, and in this case, stone tools mostly, and some bone tools that are set aside as opposed to being lost or discarded. And we forget that sometimes, I think, as archaeologists, that mostly what we're looking at are broken and used up things that have been thrown away. Caches are sort of a unique kind of assemblage in that they represent artifacts that are stored while they're still in their useful state. So they're often artifacts that still have a lot of remaining utility. They're not heavily resharpened. They're not broken and used up the way we're used to looking at. And so for that reason, they often provide sort of a window for us into what a working toolkit looks like. At least if, in the cases that they are utilitarian caches, that they are working toolkits.
So Clovis cache is not the Players Club money you get at the casino in Clovis, New Mexico. Okay, good.
It might be.
There's a great term.
In Clovis, New Mexico, there's a Clovis IPA. There are various things named after Clovis. Nice.
All right. So, I'm curious. I actually found on the in North Carolina one time, I found a cache of projectile point preforms that we called it. Obviously, nowhere close to the Clovis age. I think it was about. I think we'd ended up dating those layers to about 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. But it was really neat. They were all
northeastern Piedmont.
It was actually right out on the Cape Fear River near Wilmington, North Carolina.
Okay.
And it was right in the sand, and I was just digging away with my shovel and peeling back the layers, and I felt this tink of kind of a sandstone type material, and they were mostly preforms. They were all stacked next to each other, like they were in some kind of pouch, and then buried in that pouch, and then the pouch had since disintegrated, and you were just left with these points in various states. None of them were finished. They were all preformed, so they could make something unique out of each one of them. Right. And that was really cool concept. That was the only cache really I've ever found like that.
That's completely analogous to what we're talking about with Clovis. So Clovis caches often consist of a range of tool forms. So there may be bifaces at early stages. There may be finished projectile points, everything in between, blades, sometimes blade cores, and then also bone and ivory rods. And these are these sort of elongated tools that are a little over a foot long, often they're made out of bison long bone, or they're made out of mammoth tusk. And we don't know what they're used for, so we just call them ivory rods. And some of the Clovis caches will consist of a great variety of things and well over 100 items, while others seem very specialized. They'll be all projectile points or all blades. and look like they're for a specific function.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, what they all sort of have in common is that they're useful tools that are sort of squirreled away somewhere on the landscape, and typically away from other kinds of sites. They typically occur in isolation.
The concept of the cache is so interesting to me because, it's a little sad too, because somebody buried that expecting to go find it again and then just like either got killed or never found it again. Right. One of those things.
So arguably the ones we're looking at are the failures. They're the ones that nobody came back to.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I always make the assumption with archaeological sites, especially, that we're finding, when we find stuff, no matter what it is and no matter what time period it is, we're finding something that's in general terms, probably there's lots of them. The assumption that we would find something unique and that's a one-off is pretty arrogant, really.
Right.
With the random nature of our digging. So if you find one, you can assume there's 10 on the landscape somewhere else that you didn't find. Kind
of feeding off of this idea of uniqueness. How common are these caches? We're talking about pretty, deep prehistory in the United States and a big continent. But are there 20 of these? Are there hundreds of these caches that people have found? Just sort of the relative scale.
I was going to say, it depends on what you would call common. We know of about 25 of them, roughly. And when they were first found, and interestingly enough, the first one was identified at Blackwater Draw in New Mexico at the Clovis site itself in the 1960s. And it was a cache of blades. In that same year, another cache was found in Idaho, which was all bifaces and projectile points, called the Simon cache. And at that time, it was, in the years following that, there were 3 or 4 more that were identified in sort of pretty rapid succession. And at that time, it was thought that this must be pretty rare and something pretty special. And maybe these aren't really normal. Maybe these are some ritual or ideological aspect of Clovis, and it might be something different altogether than normal Clovis technology. For one thing, the artifacts are bigger and sometimes they seem more elaborate.
It's always ritual, isn't it?
Right, exactly. When you don't know the answer, it's either ritual or gaming.
That's right.
And they're often associated with red ochre. At least these early ones were. Mm-hmm. And so, as we've learned to better identify Clovis technology and as we become aware of caching as a phenomenon, we've recognized more and more of these. And so, like I said, today, 20 to 25, and which I would argue is pretty frequent. If you take into account, as you pointed out, that most successful caches would have been recovered, so that we're only finding the ones that were never recovered. And then you look at that relative to the density of Clovis sites in general, which is pretty low, and reflects pretty low population densities, we would assume. One of the analogies that I like to make regarding the frequency of Clovis caches is to compare them to the number of kill sites that we have. We have no problem seeing Clovis as frequent hunters of mammoth, and that's based on these recurring associations with Clovis points and mammoth remains. And yet when you look closely, there's about 14 definite associations of Clovis with mammoth or mastodon. And you compare that to 24, 25 Clovis caches, they're relatively abundant in comparison. And so you can, archaeologically, you can say that phenomenon is at least as frequent and well supported as is mammoth hunting. So I think, even though we don't have hundreds of them, I'm pretty confident that it reflects a recurring strategy among Clovis people, at least in the continental interior of North America. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty important part of their land use strategy and their technological repertoire.
Okay. I got to comment on that real quick because I always maintain a healthy skepticism when it comes to archaeology. And I feel like a lot of times things feed on each other. So you mentioned, we got about 25, caches that have been discovered and kill sites, and matching these things up. Well, Clovis, when it was first found, of course, became kind of the sexy thing to find for archaeology. And I'm wondering if, well, yeah, totally. I mean, when you talk to CRM archaeologists, they're like, Yeah. When you talk to CRM archaeologists, they're like, oh, have you ever found a Clovis point? Like, the only Clovis point I've ever seen in the field was actually attached to the tire of the pickup truck we were driving. And
wow.
we had picked up like a piece of one, which means we probably broke it, and it was in the 2-track. And that's the only one I've seen in the field. So
Wow.
we collected it, gave it to the BLM. But anyway, but it makes me wonder, like with, sure, there's stuff found all over the continent, and we have these things, and then we're making these assumptions on Clovis culture based on what we're finding. But is it real? Because, is it real, the cultural definitions that we're trying to make here? Because we're looking in certain areas and people say, well, I want to find a Clovis site, so I'm going to look in similar areas over here. And now we're finding all these kill sites, and, we don't have really much associated with habitation and the other things that they were doing to live their lives. They weren't just killing mammoths. They were gathering, roots and berries and probably grains and other things. And, they were doing other stuff to live, but we don't really have a lot of evidence of that, because are we even looking for it?
Right.
Are we looking in the right spots for it? Because we want to find the sexy kill sites and the caches and the stuff like that. So we're looking in the places where those are likely to be.
I think hunting sites are certainly more visible.
Sure.
Big bones sticking out of the side of an arroyo are not lost on anyone. And often that's how some of the Clovis sites have been found, some of the classic Clovis sites. And so certainly they're more visible. But I would say that we're looking pretty closely, for Clovis and at Clovis. And the majority of Clovis sites that we know of actually are not, definitively kill sites. They are lithic scatters. Many of them, we don't know what they represent. We're not entirely sure if they're residential campsites or sort of special activity areas. And the bigger problem there, I think, is it's not for lack of looking, but for lack of preservation. Finding sites of Clovis age that actually have sufficient, stratigraphic preservation and also sort of organic preservation to have things like fire hearths that we can do flotation analysis on and try to see what, nuts and roots and berries they may be eating. You mentioned grains. I would argue against the use of grains very much. We don't see any grinding technology.
Oh, right. Yeah, I was just throwing stuff out there.
But sure. But I think that most of us who work in this time period are pretty convinced that Clovis are doing more than hunting mammoth and bison. Their diet is broader than that. Their movements and their goals in life are more complex than that. But that's what is indeed most visible. I would argue on the plains and in the West and in the record that I'm most familiar with, that they may not necessarily be specialized big game hunters the way that Folsom and later Paleo Indians appear to be, but that hunting mammoth and hunting bison is important enough that goes a long way toward predicting their movements on the landscape, that they're strategizing according to those resources because they're so beneficial. They're such important resources. A mammoth is such a huge package of calories that, you may not take one down that often, but when you do, it's a significant windfall. So I think some of their movements around the landscape are being dictated by the movements of what we call megafauna, the big animals on the landscape.
Okay. Well, we're going to start wrapping this up. And, I want to ask you, David, based on all the things that you've read and studied and looked at, what's your hypothesis? And there might not be enough evidence for this yet, but, what is your hypothesis for migration into this North American continent?
Well, I like to be open to where the data have and will lead. But if I were abducted and somebody demanded to know what for me to make a bet on what the real truth is, I think the preponderance of the evidence points really clearly to Northeast Asia. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, now we have genetics to level at that problem as well. And, the genetic information just overwhelmingly points to Northeast Asia. There's not any signature of a European influx in deep prehistory that we've picked up on so far. One of the most interesting genomes to me that's been sequenced in recent years is the Anzac child, which is an infant of Clovis age that was buried along with the Clovis cache in Montana. and I'm not a genetics expert, so I'm probably ballparking this in a great big way, but his genome explains between 80 and 90% of the entire Native American genome in North and South America. And so it really does look like they are near the base of ancestral populations in the New World. So all that said, everything points back toward Asia and toward Beringia. Whether that means people are coming across, as land-based hunters, or whether they're picking their way along the coasts, it sort of remains to be seen. But I think the evidence is leaning more toward a coastal route. And that might help explain some of these anomalies like Monteverde and Chile. How do we get people down on the Pacific coast of Chile before we see them in, at Blackwater Draw, New Mexico? I think coastal archaeology is gonna yield some really interesting data in the coming decades that might very well add to and potentially change our ideas of colonization of North America.
Okay, sounds good. And just one last question here: where are you going from here? What are your next research interests, and what are you working on?
Well, currently I'm working on a site in West Texas, right on the Mexican border, called Bonfire Shelter. Which has three primary components of archaeological interest, and the deepest of which is about 1,000 years older than Clovis, and it is mammoth and horse and camel remains. And the question has always been, is that actually archaeological as opposed to naturally occurring? There have never been any stone tools found associated with it. Some previous researchers have argued that there's cut marks and so on. And so we're looking at that really closely. And I think that the jury's still out, but we are scrutinizing that level very closely. And the other interesting thing about Bonfire Shelter, probably the thing that most people are aware of, is that it contains the remains of what appears to be the oldest known example of a bison jump in all of the Americas. And so 12,000 years ago, a herd of these giant Pleistocene bison antiquus, were herded off the rim above, falling about 90 feet to their deaths below, right in the mouth of this rock shelter. And we have these abundant bone beds, thick beds of bison bone, which are definitively associated with spear points, mostly plain view, a couple of Folsom spear points, occasional butchering tools, and so on. And that is sort of picking that apart. How many events does that represent? Is it definitively a bison jump as opposed to some other kind of processing area? Are the goals of the research that we're undertaking there now.
Okay. Wow. I'm just trying to imagine the sound of a herd of bison falling to their deaths off a cliff, right? That's got to be horrific.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah. I don't like, a couple of times when I've really thought about it clearly, it's not a pretty sight, No,
it can't be.
It's got to be gruesome.
Yeah. Wow. But what a feast afterwards.
Yeah.
All right. Silver lining.
Probably more meat and hides than you can possibly use before you a group that size.
Right. Okay. Well, that's all we have time for, David. I'd love to have you on again when you discover all the answers to all these questions.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd love to discover them. I'll work on it.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure.
All right. And like I said, if you ever want to come on again, let us know. And for the audience, if you have any questions, send them on to us. I'm sure we could pass you on to David or, save them up for the next episode. So again, thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Archaeology Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. You can provide feedback using the contact button on the right side of the website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeology. Or you can email Chris at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Please like and share the show wherever you saw it so more people can have a chance to listen and learn. Send us show suggestions and follow ArcPodNet on Twitter and Instagram. This show is produced by the Archaeology Podcast Network. Opinions are solely those of the hosts and guests of the show. However, the APN stands by their hosts. Special thanks to the band Sea Hero for letting us use their song I Wish You'd Look. Check out their albums on Bandcamp at seahero.bandcamp.com. Check out our next episode in 2 weeks, and in the meantime, keep learning, keep discovering new things, and keep listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network. Have an awesome day. This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.